Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're looking at day number 5 from the 2017 Champions Showdown. If you're not familiar with the structure of this tournament, there's 8 of the top players in the world. Each of those players is matched up against one individual, and they play heads up, and they play 30 games over a 4-day span. It's a lot of blitz and rapid styles. You can imagine playing 30 games, but these games are intense. You see some strategies you normally don't see. 6 of those competitors, they started early, I would consider early, and they played 4 days straight. Magnus, Carlsen, Liren, the last matchup, they started on everyone else's day 3, so that the last 2 days would only be Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, and Liren. Now, Liren, if you're not too familiar, he's the top Chinese grandmaster. He's one of the 8 competitors that will be fighting in the Candidates tournament next year. The winner of the Candidates tournament goes on to face Magnus Carlsen at the end of next year for the World Championship. He got there. He was one of the top 2 finishers in the Chess World Cup 2017, along with Liren Brody. So this could actually be a preview of the World Championship next year. That will have a much different time control. In this format today, we're on the 10-minute blitz portion, and we're going to be playing 8 games today between Magnus Carlsen and Liren. Now, in the first 2 days that they played, Magnus Carlsen kind of had his way with Liren. He went up a game in day number 1. They only played 4 games, and then yesterday he went up 3 games. Now, today in day number 3 for these competitors, day 5 for the entire tournament, Liren won game 1 with the black pieces, and he's playing with the white pieces in game number 2, looking to come back and really let his opponent know that he is one of the top chess players in the world. So Liren starts out with a pawn to f3, pawn at d5, pawn g3, pawn g6, bishop g2, fianchettoing on the king side of the board, bishop g7, pawn d4, and then after pawn c6, castle on the king side, knight to f6. So this is sort of a fianchetto Grunfeld defense. We see the Grunfeld defense quite often, especially for Magnus Carlsen, but we usually don't see it with white playing the fianchetto on the king side. Not a normal setup. You know, we used to see this from Karpov back in the day. Kasparov, he played pretty much every opening, so he had some great success with this, but just not something we see that often. But as we've seen so far in the Champions Showdown, we're seeing all sorts of openings, trying to catch their opponent off guard. You only have 10 minutes, so any small advantage that you can use, you're pretty much bringing it out right now. White continues with pawn to b3, castle on the king side, bishop to b2. So fianchetto both sides of the board. Also something we don't see too often, maybe trying to confuse Magnus Carlsen. Magnus is going to continue with normal development, bishop to f5, sort of that Slav defense where he can play pawn to e6, solidifies pawn chain, but he does have his light toward bishop outside his pawn chain already. Pawn up to c4, threatening on the queen side of the board, a knight to d7, defending this square here on f6. Also, if he wants to bring it to b6, fairly common, start to attack the queen side of the board as well. Pawn to e3, and then knight down here to e4. So a couple options. Kind of expected him just to play this pawn to e6 to solidify pawn chain, but decides instead, hey, there's nothing really stopping my knight right here. Many times the knight will already be here on d2. White might already have his queen c2 as well. He doesn't really have those threats, so he decides, hey, it's a good opportunity to go ahead and play knight to e4 in the center of the board. Knight comes back d2, says, yeah, let's go ahead and exchange if you want to. Knight to f6, defending this, really likes this square, so says, hey, let's go ahead and exchange if you want to. Knight takes, bishop retakes, because he's fine. If in this particular spot Liren wants to recapture, it's going to be a lot tougher for white to kick off this knight here, can apply a lot of pressure to his opponent. So in here, we don't see Liren exchange. He decides to instead play bishop here to h3. And now queen to b6. Not too much he can do on the king side of the board. Recognizes that the queen side's probably the place that he wants to go to. And this also allows him to add a little bit more pressure on this pawn on d4 and this square as a whole. Once his knight moves, his bishop will also be lining up that. He can push forward with pawn to c5, attack that square as well. Pawn to f3, forcing the bishop to move. Can't really gum back here to f5. It's definitely not going to take here. So really just has to end up exchanging on b1 after the rook recaptures pawn e6, solidifying the pawn chain. So Ding Liren does have the bishop pair, but bishops usually tend to do well on a open board state, meaning there's not a lot of pawns in the center of the board. So all things considered, I'd say it's pretty much even. There's not a lot of king safety for White's perspective. His pawns are pushed a little bit forward, but he does have a solid base right here. It's going to be tough for Magnus Carlsen to really break through. Magnus Carlsen also has a good pawn structure. Neither side really has an initiative. Really just comes down to time control. Is anyone going to make a mistake or try to find a small advantage to push through on their opponent? Ding Liren plays queen to d3, just centralizing. Rook e8, getting involved into the board. Pawn c5 pushes forward, gains space from White. Queen back to c7. Pawn e4, starting to push in the center of the board. Pawn b6, attacking on the queen side. Both sides recognizing what they need to do. White needs to continue to push forward, choke his opponent from moves. And from Black's perspective, Magnus really needs to just blow up the queen side of the board. Pawn to e5, forcing the knight comes back here to d7, pawn b4, pawn a5, and so there's no real way, especially with the pawns just blocked in the center of the board. This knight's not going to be going anywhere for a while. You'll see Magnus Carlsen start to load up on the queen side of the board. Pawn to a3, rook to b8, swing it over to the queen side as expected. Bishop c3, bishop comes back here to f8. This bishop's not doing a whole lot, but he recognizes there could be some exchanges on board. And also, always have to keep in mind that this pawn did move to f3. And that was a little bit earlier on, but it does, something for us to think about, as if there is an exchange on board, you could always have a bishop that checks this king here on g1, forces it to move, could gain some tempo later on in the game. Rook here to c1, pawn takes, pawn recaptures. We start to see exchange on the board, and now rook to a3. And this is where things get kind of crazy, because Magnus Carlsen, he's kind of struck first as far as getting in his opponent's territory. And how does White respond here? Well, he has a few options. Really, the best strategy would play rook to a1, and then, rook down here, b3, trying to double up. But then you see an exchange. Rook here to a1 says, hey, if you want to exchange, that's fine with me. Now the board's starting to open up a little bit, but he has the bishop pair. All in all, I think this is going to be a good board state for White. But in the game, he decides to play bishop to f1. And, as you kind of look at this, it doesn't look too bad, but Magnus Carlsen actually sees what we talked about just a minute ago, and that is he can give up his knight here on c5. And after the pawn recaptures, bishop recaptures, bishop takes c5 check. Now he has two passed pawns in the center of the board. He did give up his knight, but he has a huge attack after this. King to h1, and now he pushes forward. Pawn d4, forcing the bishop to move. There's an in-between move. Sometimes you always look for ways to have an in-between move that your opponent has to respond to. This is check after that. So queen to b8. And then, okay, something else has to give. Hey, if you want to take my bishop, I'll take your bishop as well. So we see the rook take on c3 first. All these moves kind of in between before that pawn were to take. So rook takes on c3. Pawn just going to capture now here on c3. And now in this position, what would you do if you're White's perspective? He has a couple options as far as if he wants to take material or if he wants to try something else. But curious from your perspective, feel free to pause it, analyze the game. But what would you do in this position if you were Ding Liren? Now, honestly, what he probably should have done is take right here on c3. And with just a few seconds, it's tough to analyze just how deadly a passed pawn can be when it comes that far up the board. He decided to go ahead and take this bishop here on c5. It's more material, but the problem is queen down here to b1 is deadly. Now from here, he has to stop queen to f1. That's one of the biggest hurdles that he has to worry about. But he also has to worry about the pawn coming down here to c2. And it doesn't really matter how he stops this. If he plays queen to c4, stopping this bishop here on f1, Okay, well then just pawn to c2. He also just can't take this material here because that's going to be checkmate. That's the worst case scenario. He also can't play queen to g1 because just that continued push down here, pawn to c2. In the game, he played king to g2. None of it really matters. Pawn to c2, and then queen up here to d6. Queen to d1 says, hey, let's go and exchange on board. I'll just recapture with my pawn. I'll get a queen on board. This will be extremely good for me. There's no way I can lose this. Liren decides after queen d1, bishop up here d3. He needs to stop this queen threat. He wants to come up here, queen to d8, and then have a perpetual check. And this is really his last option on board. Then we see queen to d2, check, forcing the king to move, king to h3, and then queen to h6. And in this position, there was a resignation. If you look at it, and this is sometimes tough, people get ahead of themselves and they see, well, queen to h6. He still has a lot of moves. He could play king to g4. He could come back here to g2. So I'm just going to go ahead and get material. I'll play pawn down here to c1. I'll get that queen. And hey, this is going to be an easy game. The problem is this is actually a drawn game because that bishop we talked about here on d3 is blocking these queens from getting involved. So queen up here, d8 check, forces the king to move. And now with this pawn here on e5, an outpost for the queen, queen to f6, forcing the king to move. Hey, queen down here to h5, only has one move from here, comes back, and we could just keep this party going all day long, and this is a drawn game. So if we come back, it's like, where does black move? Well, he really needs to come here to h6. Now, Liren did decide to go ahead and resign in this position. People always ask what would have happened after this. Let's say he tried the king to g4. Okay, pawn down here, f5. There's two ways to capture. One move would just be with en passant. The pawn takes right here. Then queen to h5, check. And then queen down here, c1, check, getting a queen. This is all going to be bad. We're eventually going to end up with checkmates. If he didn't do that, let's say instead of taking with his pawn with en passant, maybe try something different. Maybe bishop takes here on f5. Okay, well, that's going to be checkmate right here. That's one option. If he also, from queen to h6, decided, let's come back here to g2, then queen down here to c1, does not have to worry about that perpetual check that we talked about, because let's say queen up here to d8, now he can just stop it with queen to f8. And then maybe queen down here to d4. How does black continue? Well, queen d2 check, forcing the king to move, and then queen over here to a8, getting ready to bring his queen evolved down on this first rank, start to attack his opponent. There's no way for white to hold on to this. So Liren in this position decided to go ahead and resign. And although Magnus Carlsen lost game 1 when he had the white pieces, he went on to win 6 of the remaining 7 games. You play 8 games on day number 3. Magnus Carlsen won 6 of the remaining 7. So just went on a tear. So for 3 days straight, he's just been destroying his opponent. We'll look to continue that tomorrow when they play 12 games of 5-minute blitz games. That should definitely be exciting. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this game and you've been enjoying the tournament so far. But thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.